much for coming out to this wonderful event that will remember the Cuban printmaker Belkis Ayón. I am Jill Lane, the Director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies here at NYU, and it's really my honor, my pleasure to welcome you all here, to welcome the speakers, and tell you how privileged and pleased we are to have your company tonight. This is an event that was put together through a collaboration that, from my point of view, was a sort of power team of the Museo del Barrio, the Institute of Fine Arts, the King Juan Carlos Center, in whose auditorium we are now sitting, and the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, again here at NYU. And from our part, we really have valued the opportunity to work with the Institute of Fine Arts and with the Museo, and we're hoping there will be more such collaborations in the future. I wanted to thank the organizers, Edward Sullivan, Deputy Director of the Institute of Fine Arts, and Helen Gould-Shepherd, Professor in the History of Art, and also Rocio Aranda Alvarado, who is Curator at the Museo del Barrio. There are many people to whom you will be introduced in the next few minutes. It's my pleasure to after thanking you one more time, to hand the mic over to Patrick Chapanet, the Executive Director of the Museo del Barrio.
Thank you for being here tonight. Well, we would like to say that for Museo del Barrio, it's very exciting and very important to make these partnerships with NYU. It's really important to be programming exhibitions where Caribbean, Latino, Latin American art is being presented, and we are a very important platform to give visibility to Latino cultural expressions. And please, if you haven't gone and seen the exhibition at the galleries of El Museo del Barrio, it's a good opportunity. It will be on until the 5th of November. And thank you, Professor Sullivan, for organizing this panel. Thank you, NYU. Good night.
Well, I'm extremely pleased that you're all here, and I'm going to do a number of things. I'm going to be the moderator. I am Edward Sullivan, and I'm extremely honored to have this opportunity to help in the organization of this program about Belkis Ayón. And in a couple of minutes, from what I say about Belkis, you'll probably understand why it's much more than a panel about art or a panel about printmaking. It's something for me personally, and for a number of us in this room, it is a personal homage to a friend. But before I say anything of my own, I would like to relate to you the words of Katia Ayón, the sister of Belkis. So Belkis Ayón, when she very sadly died at an extremely young age, the estate of Belkis, which is almost entirely together in Havana, was taken over by her sister. Her sister was a very distinguished medical doctor in Havana who basically gave up her practice to dedicate herself to the organization of the estate, the collection of Belkis's work. And it is Katia Ayón, who has been really the prime mover and the person who has been most enthusiastically involved in the dissemination of knowledge about the work of Belkis, and was behind the exhibition, about which I'll talk in just a couple of minutes. But first of all, Katia sent to all of us, not just to some of us, but to all of us, her words of greeting. And I think that it's important that I read them in the original words of greeting and then in the English words of greeting to pay homage to Belkis, to Katia, and to her family and friends in Cuba and in here. So if you will indulge me, I'll say both what Katia sent us and then the English translation. So she wrote, I think a few days ago, "Queridos amigos, Para nosotros fue una agradable sorpresa recibir la noticia de la realización de este conversatorio sobre la vida y la obra de Belkis Ayón. Como familia y estate de su obra, para nosotros es motivo de orgullo representar y promover el trabajo de Belkis y nos regocijamos cuando acciones como estas se realizan para recordar su vida y su legado artístico. Queremos extender un sincero agradecimiento al Museo del Barrio y a las instituciones neoyorquinas que se han unido para hacer este evento posible, el cual será de gran reconocimiento e importancia para la obra de Belkis. Asimismo, agradecemos al prestigioso panel reunido aquí hoy para ofrecer este conversatorio a todos y cada uno de los presentes. Muchas gracias por este homenaje y sentimos mucho no estar presentes junto a ustedes en esta hermosa ocasión. Gracias a todos por ser parte del empeño que hace que la obra de Belkis Ayón llegue en todo su esplendor a un público cada vez más amplio. And I thank Horacio Ramos for his translation, Horacio of the Graduate Center and of the El Museo. So in English, Katia says to us, "Dear friends, it was a pleasant surprise to hear about this panel on the life and work of Belkis Ayón. As the family and estate of her work, we're proud to represent and to promote the work of Belkis, and we rejoice when events that remember her life and artistic legacy take place. We extend our sincere gratitude to el Museo del Barrio, the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at NYU, King Juan Carlos I of Spain Center, and the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU for making this event possible. This program is of great importance for the recognition of Belkis' oeuvre. Furthermore, we thank the prestigious panel gathered today in this talk and to each and every one of the people present here. Thank you so much for this homage. We truly regret not being there with you in this beautiful occasion. Thank you for being part of the efforts that allows Belkis Ayón's artistic output to reach a broader audience in its entire splendor." So, thank you to Katia for those words. So, again, if you'll indulge me, I'll say a couple of words about my relationship to Belkis Ayón, and then say a few things about why this panel is important, and then talk to you about who is going to be present, who's going to present rather, and the order in which we will do it. First, Belkis is here with us tonight. Her spirit, her art, her smile, and her laugh. Belkis was my friend, an inspiration, and my dance partner on the rooftop of the Fundación Ludwig de Cuba, the Plaza de Armas, or the Centro Wifera Dolan at the times of the openings of various Havana biennials. I saw her teach at the ISA, I saw her work in her studio, and realized the inexplicable impact that she had on virtually everyone with whom she came into contact. Belkis Ayón was a master artist and a master teacher who worked with a generation of artists that changed the face of Cuban visual culture. But more than anything else, we should remember that Belkis was a woman of color, una mujer cubana de color. This is saying many things in any context, and especially in a Cuban one. As anyone who knows the socio-political temper of Cuba since the revolution, the rhetoric praises itself for having established what we would call today a post-racial country. I find this to be a claim rather difficult to maintain. Simply looking at the history of pre- and post-revolutionary art in Cuba, we can easily observe that the number of significant women artists is relatively few. The modernist Amelia Peláez, the geometric abstract painter Lolo Soldevilla, and more recently Sandra Ramos or Tania Bruguera, among others. Please note that as splendid as their works are, these were all white women, namely of the elite classes. The art world, in a certain sense, mirrors that of the traditions of patriarchal society. Please do not think that by any means that I'm denigrating any of the great number of significant players in the drama of Cuban modern and contemporary art. But I do wish to underscore, in a way that is not often articulated appropriately, the achievement and the tenacity and the valor of Belkis Ayón, a black artist of color, rising to the top of her profession and then disappearing just as she was receiving the greatest accolades within and outside her native country. Belkis Ayón's principal subject was religion, specifically the Afro-Cuban religion of Abakuá, a a spiritual pathway dominated by men. And of this we will speak at length this evening, in her devotion to the thematics of the spiritual, including the bright and the obscure forces of nature and the orishas. Belkis may also be linked to other Cuban artists of the modern and contemporary era. I'm thinking specifically of Wilfredo, her Afro-Cuban predecessor in the expression of the intensity of African-based religious subjects. I'm also thinking about such contemporary artists as Manuel Mendive or Jose Bedia, among others, artists who have tapped into and mined the complex meanings of the signs, symbols, and emotive impulses that arrived into Cuba through the Middle Passage of enslavement. So now I want to simply make a couple of comments about my gratitude to people who have put this together. Of course, the exhibition is the point of departure for this program and for so much of our reconsideration of the work of Belkis. There has never been, even in her representations in the Venice Biennial or the many exhibitions of which she had participated during her lifetime and after her lifetime, this exhibition, so beautifully curated by Cristina Vives from Havana, and first presented at the Fowler Museum at UCLA, and very happily here at El Museo, and I urge you all to see it. It is literally a miraculous experience. As I said, I consider myself a dear friend of Belkis. I miss her terribly. And when I went there to see that exhibition, I spent hours and hours literally in tears. It is something, even if you never knew her or if you've never heard of her, you will be moved, I'm sure, by many things, by the pieces, by the technique, which is unique and extraordinary, and the size and the ambition and the bravery that she embodied in order to do this work. So, and of course, I also am very happy to say that I am so pleased with all of my colleagues at El Museo. Patrick gave a very lovely introduction, and Rocio Aranda, and all of the equipo at the El Museo, and that of the King Juan Carlos Center, and my own institution, the Institute of Fine Arts. I'm very grateful to all of them. So I want to just say a word before we start about how the evening will go. There are a variety of ways that we're going to approach Belkis's work. First of all, Carol and Alex Rosenberg and I will have a conversation about Belkis. Carol and Alex Rosenberg are the people who, in a way, introduced me to Belkis. Actually, the way that I first knew her was in August of 1994 at the Museum of Fine Arts, when Elmo Hernandez, who was the director, was then and still is the director of the Fundación Ludwig de Cuba, introduced me on my first trip of many to Havana to literally dozens of artists over the period of days. It was like a Hollywood interview or something. Every half an hour I had another half an hour with Cacho, with Belkis, with Carlos Esteves, with Carlos Carpinteros, with Tonel, with Sandra Ramos, and all these names that make the era of the 90s and the early 2000s this heroic period of art during this special period of Cuba's suffering after the end of the Soviet aid to Cuba and the terrible privations that were felt by the people of Cuba, but that stimulated at the same time extraordinary artistic renaissance in Havana. So Alex and Carol Rosenberg, very shortly thereafter, I went with them to Cuba. They are very distinguished promoters of the art of Cuba. Carol Rosenberg is the president of the American Friends of the Ludwig Foundation. Alex Rosenberg, a very distinguished art dealer, art historian, and also a publisher of prints, and is somebody who knows a huge amount about Cuban art and also artistic and legal ramifications between the two countries. Our brief conversation will be followed by Blanca Serrano, who is an independent art historian and curator who has specialized in Cuban art. She very recently finished a very enlightening PhD dissertation about art in the time of the special period, and she will share some of her knowledge about that and place Belkis within that art historical panorama. And then Professor David Brown will speak, and Professor David Brown is somebody who is perhaps more knowledgeable than anyone else about Abakuá and Afro-Cuban religions. And so we will take the panel then into a broader area and talk about the atmosphere, the religious, and the spiritual auras and all of the things about these the orishas and the figures in Abakuá and other Afro-American religions that he has worked on in Brazil and Cuba, in the United States, and elsewhere. And finally, Yesenia Fernandez-Sedier, who is a dancer, a performance artist, a writer, and somebody whose performances, which I have witnessed, are utterly captivating and capture within them the spirit of the orishas, of Santeria, and of other African-based religions in Cuba and elsewhere in the Caribbean. So I think after that, then if there is time, we will have a conversation with the public, with you, and I am quite sure that this panorama will succeed in putting the art and the spirit of Belkis Ayón, as well as the Afro-Cuban spirituality that she grows out of, within a very wide context. So, could I ask Alex and Carol to come and have Alex, why don't you sit right here, and Carol, you can sit there, and are these on? No. Could somebody turn on the microphones? Oh, this one's on. So, okay, so each of the segments will be fairly brief, so that we will give you time to cogitate, think about some of the things you want to ask us. And so I think I would like to just begin, and I'm going to be not only the facilitator. I have many more. I could give a whole lecture about Belkis or a whole course. And those of you who know me know that I'm very enthusiastic about lots of things, and Belkis is certainly at the top of my mind, but I'm just going to turn it over to Carol and Alex, because they knew Belkis so well and so intimately. And Carol, I think it would be nice if you talked to us a little bit about how you first encountered her and what you thought of her as a person, because she was a very charismatic woman.
Well, I'd like to start by just giving you a very, very brief overview of how Alex and I got to Cuba, because we have no relatives there. We're not in any way connected to Cuba. But Alex was always a strong civil libertarian, and in the late 80s, early 90s, a Cuban-American art dealer was arrested for bringing art from Havana to Miami. And Alex at that time was the chairman of a civil liberties organization, and he had a whole history behind him, going back to the 60s, of being a very strong civil libertarian. So as an art dealer, he would have standing in court, and he was asked by the organization if he would take a case against the US government. Well, if you knew Alex, you would know that that for him was like, oh, couldn't wait to get started. So he did that, just that. He said he would certainly take a case against the government on behalf of our First Amendment, freedom of speech, which art is covered under, and outside of the embargo. So it didn't. He was going to take it in his own name. When he decided it might be just a little too weak, why not get the rest of the art world involved? And so he sat down and wrote 100 letters. At the time, we had an art gallery on 57th Street. And he wrote 100 letters, and he got 70 favorable replies, knowing he couldn't list that many names. He selected the ones that would be most recognizable by the government. And it didn't take long before they contacted us and asked what was behind it. And he, of course, said they wanted to break the embargo. He always says he regrets that, I always tell him, they're not stupid. They would know that within a minute. Anyway, so the government didn't want to end the embargo, and they found a way to make art legal to go between the two countries. Of course, art dealers would need a license. They never really discussed or told how they got the license, but you know, art dealers that were really interested found ways to go. And shortly thereafter, the ambassador to the United Nations from the Cuban mission asked one of his deputies to call Alex and look to meet him and thank him on behalf of his government. And exactly that happened, and so he was very persistent. Alex said he didn't do anything for the Cuban government, but the man insisted he wanted to meet Alex, and we invited him to lunch, and at the lunch he asked if we'd ever been to Cuba. He was very, very interesting, very charming. And I had never been to Cuba, but Alex had, because his father used to winter there in Miami. And it was customarily before the revolution to just go off for a few days. So he said that he would ask his government to invite us to the Havana Biennial, and it happened. In '91, we got an invitation from the Cuban government to be their guest at that biennial. And off we went, and we're very delighted to find that all of Alex's colleagues who were working in Europe were there. So we felt very much at home, and we had the occasion to have dinner with the head of the biennial, whose husband was an extraordinary person, and that became, and it was interesting because I mentioned the husband because he went to Harvard, his father went to Harvard, his grandfather went to Harvard. So you can imagine who we were meeting with and dining with. And it turned out that Alex knew 2 of his roommates at college. I mean, the odds on that are like a zillion to 1. So that was the start of a very strong friendship. And Alex was very, very touched by all of the art that we saw, especially in the art school, ISA, the Higher Institute of Art, and the artists that we met during that week. He got even more interested than I did at the time, and he went back many, many times, giving lectures, bringing exhibitions. It was very easy for him as a publisher of art to pack up a portfolio with American artists. The only artist that the artists there seemed to know, the young ones in school, was Robert Rauschenberg, because a few years before he had brought his Rocky project there. So that is pretty much how we got to Cuba. And any of you who've been there know it's very seductive. And the artists were just very special. And then I think on our next trip, must have been in '92, we met Belkis. And we met her. Did we meet her, Alex, before we met Helmo? Okay, so we met Helmo Hernandez, the president, my partner in Cuba, of the Olympic Foundation of Cuba. We met him when he came to the United States because an art dealer in Bridgehampton decided she'd like to make an exhibition of Cuban art, and went off with a friend of hers who had a boat. She collected a whole lot of Cuban art and made a wonderful exhibition. Helmo came to see that exhibition and came to visit us. That was our friendships with Helmo began there, and that might have been in '92 or '93. '92. So Alex was great at remembering all these details. So then when we went to Cuba right after that, Helmo said he wanted to introduce us to Belkis. Why? Because Alex had a long history of printmaking. Not only was he a print publisher, but he also studied printmaking at the schools of the Philadelphia Museum, which is where he ultimately graduated from, a long, long time ago. Anyway, So we met Belkis and saw her work. We were absolutely taken, you know, it was just overwhelming because we were working with printmakers for years and could not believe what we were seeing. And so we became very, very friendly with her. And as a matter of fact, even before American Friends of the Ludwig Foundation of Cuba was founded, which was in 2000, and when we started this professional development program where we invited many artists and art historians to come and gave them opportunities to develop their careers, we took her to the United States. And I can tell you that personally, I turned a part of my apartment into a gallery, because at that point we didn't have a gallery any longer, and I just hung, I covered every window with photograph paper and just showed as many prints as we could possibly fit in the room. Everyone, I couldn't believe how many people showed up and how many people bought everything they could lay their hands on. I mean, she really just captivated anyone who knew anything about art prints and the creation of them. So that started a very, very long, very personal relationship. And actually, I was very, very saddened by the fact that she had just gotten a distinguished professorship through my efforts at Washington University, and it would have been a wonderful experience for the students there to have had that experience with her, but she passed away, and shortly, I would say a month before she passed away, she was in Philadelphia working in Brandywine print shop, workshop, and teaching at teaching at Temple, but not courses, but workshops. And she was so happy. I went there to visit her, and it must have been 3 to 4 weeks before she died, and it was almost hard to believe that this would happen. I will just finish by saying that I helped her get some exhibitions together with Elsa Mora at Phyllis Kind Gallery in Cambridge and Soho. And just after she died, there was a woman who wanted to write about her and asked if she could come and see slides and talk to me. And I showed her all these wonderful slides, and I took all the works that Phyllis Kind had and lined them around my room. And they were very, very troubled. When you looked at them in the gallery, I don't know, they just looked like Belkis's figures and her life amidst the Abakuá. But when you really looked very carefully, of course, we had the situation of knowing that she committed suicide, so we knew that she had a lot of demons going on. It was easy to see that she was very, very, very tortured and very troubled. So I'm just thrilled to have had the experience with her little clan of Sandra Ramos and Abel Barroso and Ibrahim Miranda. And it was really just one of the highlights of my life to have met someone like her. I have photographs of her smiling. I never saw her without a laugh, a smile, a happiness. I spent many, many days in a hotel room with Wilfredo Benitez, the now executive director of the Ludwig Foundation in Cuba, translating what she was just saying in all of those wonderful prints and all the stories behind them. And it was a very, very important part in my life.
I'm sure that what you have said is, well, you had a very special relationship with her, but she was charismatic in a way that very few people I had ever met were charismatic. But she was also an amazing technician. And Alex, you and I have talked for years about the way she did her prints and the types of materials that she used. And so I'd be very grateful if you could talk a little bit more about that with our public.
I would just like to make one comment. Life is not always just. I'd say that Belkis Ayón, had she been born in the United States and had worked here, she would be today considered to be on the same level as Tom Wesselman, Henry Moore, or any of the other great printmakers. The thing that set her apart is the fact that she had invented a method of making prints, and her prints have still not been copied. No one has succeeded in making prints the way she did or having the same effect that she did. She was original, and she remains unique. I can tell you this, that when I saw the way she worked, I was aghast. I'd never seen an artist work this way. She was using old Russian cardboard as matrices, craft, and she had gotten hold of some carborundum someplace, but she didn't have a real epoxy, so she was using her make-believe epoxies. And I finally said to her, here's money, go to Spain and buy some material. So she went off to Spain. She came back, I said, did you buy the paper? Because she was using old Russian paper with short staple. It was waste paper from which they made art paper. And you couldn't really do very much because the staple was so short that her third dimension was destroying the paper if she wasn't very careful, because all her work were collographs. They were done with a matrix to give it a third dimension. And she said to me, I tried, but I can't work on it. She was so accustomed to working with what she had. And it's an example of a great artist having limited material, but produces great work because there is no other material to use. And one of the main reasons that others have not been able to copy her is no one in their right mind would use old Russian craft paper and waste paper to make her prints. And they hold up remarkably well if nobody touches them, but they are done as no one else before has done work. And I would like, notwithstanding what this little brochure says about me, I know Belkis's work not only from working with her, but I am a visiting professor at IFA in Havana, so that I am part of that whole system that produced her. It's a remarkable system that has produced so many great printmakers that we don't know, and great artists. I don't want to dwell on it, but I would say that it'll be a long time before someone so deprived of the elementary materials from which prints are made will again be able to produce any prints, let alone some of the greatest prints ever made. She will go down as probably one of the best printmakers that ever lived.
Thank you so much. That really, both of those evocations, I think, really set the stage so beautifully for the other things that the rest of the panel will say. So thank you very, very much, Carol and Alex. So I would like to invite Blanca Serrano to podium.
Well, good evening, and thank you for coming. Many thanks to el Museo del Barrio, especially to Rocío Alvarado and Maite Basaguren for inviting me to participate in this panel, and thank you to the King Juan Carlos I of Spain Center and New York University for hosting this event. It is a pleasure to discuss the work of wonderful artist Belkis Ayón in the company of experts such as Professor Sullivan, Carol and Alex Rosenberg, David Brown, and Yesenia Fernandez-Celia. So today I'm going to do a very brief presentation. We were asked to stay like within 5-7 minutes in order to have enough time for a great discussion between everyone. Today I would like to discuss the work of Belkis Ayón as an extraordinary example of el nuevo arte cubano, the art produced in Cuba since the late 1980s and throughout the 1990s. Too often, not in this exhibition, but in general books on Cuban art, has Ayón's work been described as an exception, as haunting and mysterious, but difficult to categorize and interpret. My goal is not to insert her into a specific box or label, but to put her pieces in conversation with those of her colleagues in order to understand the full complexity of Ayón's project as an artist. Tonight, I will very briefly, for the sake of time, suggest some relations, both formal and conceptual, between her work and that of her peers working in Havana during the same period. El nuevo arte cubano, the new Cuban art, could be succinctly summarized as a young artist's turn to an art that was oriented toward a critical examination of the self and of the revolutionary project through the languages of international conceptualism. Using citations and appropriations, as well as media experimentation, these artists reflected on individual and collective social conflicts, and most importantly, they dwelled on the significance and purpose of art making in post-1959 Cuba. Within this context, Ayón carried out a profound technical renovation of printmaking in order to ponder on the question of racial and gender equality on the Marxist-Leninist island, which, as Professor Sullivan mentioned, it was not so clear whether the revolution had achieved racial and gender equality. Printmaking in Cuba had been mostly used in cigar and sugar labels at the turn of the 19th century, but it was not until the 1970s that it was taught to students at fine art schools and workshops. So basically it had been regarded as a decorative art. It was in the 80s and the 90s, though, as Cuban art critic David Mateo has studied, when the artists demonstrated that printmaking was as suited for the exploration of cultural and social issues as any other media. Ayón was at the forefront of this change, along with Ibrahim Miranda, Sandra Ramos, Abel Barroso, with whom she founded the collective exhibitions of prints La Huella Múltiple in 1996, which has been ongoing on and off since it began. Among the many other artists who engage in printmaking then are figures like Yamilis Brito, Nelson Dominguez, Ángel Alfaro, and Luis Cabrera, but unfortunately we don't have time to look at everyone's work today. After having received several international awards, Ibrahim Miranda and Belkis Ayón were the first printmakers to be included in the Havana Biennial next to other contemporary artists, instead of being relegated within the printmaking galleries. The intensity of the black ink, the vigorous rhythm of the lines, and the repetition of patterns, as well as the intriguing, mystical quality of the figures, are some of the common features between Miranda's and Ayón's oeuvre. The rich texture of Ayón's collographies, made from thick palimpsest-like matrices in which layers of paper, cardboard, and other materials are superposed but never carved, seems to precede Sandra Ramos' collage prints, in which the artist combines etching with watercolor and vintage photographs. So we sort of mentioned that, but you know that Ayón's collographies, instead of like carving the matrix, she adheres different layers and textures. In this work, Ramos resorts to a metaphorical self-portrait, not unlike Ayón did in her images of Sikán, to present herself as child, woman, and nation. The large scale of Ayón's works and her use of the gallery walls to propel the prints into the space seems almost like an anticipation of Abel Barroso's three-dimensional installations in which the artist displays the raw wooden matrices of his prints as sculptural elements. So instead of showing the printed paper, Barroso displays the matrix. And he would later go on to create like three-dimensional objects from the matrices. This image corresponds to Barroso's participation in El Oficio del Arte, a controversial exhibition curated by Danis Montes de Oca at the Centro de Desarrollo de las Artes Visuales in 1995. The show included the work of 14 artists who, according to the curator, exemplified the, quote, return to craftsmanship, unquote, in contemporary Cuban art, and whose work dialogue with the visual codes of carpentry, cabinet making, jewelry, folk plasterwork, and ceramics. Among the other artists in the exhibition was, for example, Douglas Perez, whose oil on canvas evoked the often racist imagery of cigar and sugar labels for which printmaking had been originally used for, or traditionally used for. The artist collective Los Carpinteros was also included in the show. Their 1990s often engaged with crafts and manual trades, such as cigar label, which also alluded to the 19th century use of printmaking and its relation to class and race. I would not like to conclude without briefly pointing out some visual relations between Ayón's work and the work of other Cuban artists who also reflected on issues of race and gender. Inspired by the writings of Afro-Caribbean culture, by anthropologists Fernando Ortiz and Lidia Cabrera, as well as by Christian symbols, especially Byzantine, and even Japanese prints, Ayón developed a particular corpus of syncretic iconography, with which she took on the endeavor of illustrating for the first time ever the oral tradition of the Abakuá legends. By doing this, Ayón was challenging both the Abakuá prohibition of religious imagery and the Cuban government's prohibition of cults, or sects. There are many artists who revisited the Afro-Caribbean heritage of the island whose work we could bring into discussion today, such as Juan Francisco Padilla, Esterio Segura, Alejandro Aguilera, and Pedro Álvarez. Again, for the sake of brevity, though, I would like to show a few works where skin, surface, and pattern are particularly relevant. Here are some formal and thematic resonances between Belkis Ayón and printmaker José Bedia, both of whom resorted to craftsmanship and the makeshift in relation to ritual and practices and religious icons. Less obvious, perhaps, is photographer René Peña's and Ayón's shared view of the black skin as a text, inscribed, tattoo, and suitable for camouflage and metamorphosis. Similarly, the fish scales, concentric circles, dots, and crosses that cover the bodies in Ayón's collagraphs also bring to mind the pictograms in Manuel Mendive's body paint performances. Last but not least, I would like to include other women artists who, like Ayón, also explored themes of womanhood and feminism through the language of the African vernacular. We could discuss the work of Ana Mendieta, Tania Bruguera, Lisette Castillo Valdés, and many others, but I think that these two images that I'm going to show now by Marta María Pérez Bravo and María Magdalena Campos Pons resonate well with Ayón's collagraphs of the Abakuá rebel character of Sikán, in which the artist was her own model. Under similar titles that allude to the concept of protection, in these works, both artists resort to self-portraits and alter egos as a communication tool to channel their own experiences, and they hide their identity, while at the same time they expose their self-defense mechanisms. And that is all that I brought today, just to suggest a few ideas. I hope you have been able to illustrate that Ayón was by no means the odd man out, but a first-rate example of the new Cuban art. Thank you.
Quite a hard act to follow. I do appreciate the invitation, and I'm just really thrilled to be here and to see familiar faces. Okay, what I have for you here on the left is a photograph that I took in 1992 of my friend Juan Gutierrez Bosa, Juan Mokongo, who inherited the custodianship of the objects of this Abakuá lodge, Efori Tongo, in Regla. And one of the things I just want you to notice is an extraordinary embroidered banner produced probably in the 1970s based on the myth of Sikán. I actually brought I came prepared. So in all of what we've been looking at, we haven't seen anything from the Abakuá. So what I thought to do was actually, since it's such a complex picture, to maintain the photograph of Guango and Mokongo on the left-hand side, and then show some drawings from actual Abakuá notebooks, because we really haven't seen those. And so I just want you to notice that I'm just going to read just a little bit and then contextualize. The Abakuá Society is a fraternal order of African origin located exclusively in Havana and Matanzas province. Membership is by initiation. Each lodge is structured hierarchically into 25 or more principal offices called plazas, ruling over a group of brothers who are called ocobios or opuneques. 4 senior chiefs, 3 minor chiefs, and 6 or more other officials are initiated to a specific set of sacred objects called la potencia, like the power, the potency. And these objects outlive the members of the lodge. So really what you're seeing is a group of objects. I want you to notice 3 drums in front: equeñón, encrícamo, and empegó. And then in the center is the seseribo, which is a chalice-shaped drum covered with leopard skin that has 4 plumes. Each of the 7 chiefs have their particular plume. So you'll notice that Equeñón's drum has a plume, Encricamo's drum has a plume, Empegó's drum has a plume, and then the Sese has 4 plumes for the 4 senior chiefs of the lodge: Iamba, Mokongo, Iswe, and Isuneque, and each of them have a particular role. So it's, and I'll talk about it in just a minute. The Sese is really a kind of eternal embodiment of Sikán and Tanse. Sikán being the woman who unwittingly captured the fish in her gourd by the Odan River, and Tanse, or Obon Tanse, who was the incarnation of the high god Abasi. So not very many people speak about this object, but I was allowed to photograph it. Guango was quite interested in education, and he really believed that the divulgation of things Abakuá would be quite edifying for people. And what I've given you on the left is a drawing from an Abakuá manual of an Abakuá procession. You'll notice the masked figure, Idame, and you have a costume right here. This is his particular costume, which he goes out and dances during ceremonies. Another thing I want you to notice, and this is not often, this is a male society. Only so-called hombres de verdad are allowed, that is, real men, and an investigation is conducted as to their manhood. The entire lodge goes to their family and says, has he been a good son? Has he been good to his mother? Has he not hit his wife? How is he to his children? How is he in the neighborhood? So an investigation is conducted. So what you're seeing is 7 principal chiefs of the lodge, each of whom carries a particular emblem here. And what you'll notice is that this figure, the Iswe of the lodge, I-S-U-E, he is the custodian of the Sese, and he will carry the Sese at the head of the procession, because essentially Tanse and Sikán march at the beginning of that procession. And then you'll see Encricamo over here with his particular, this is Encricamo's drum. It'll be taken off the altar and taken out into procession, sometimes in the street in Havana, in the neighborhood in which the particular group is located. So you'll see Encricamo manipulating and guiding the masked dancer. And then you have the orchestra called Bianco Meco. You have a line of initiates, or indisemes, who have been chalked over with particular signs. And so this is essentially the potencia mobilized for procession in the street. Okay. So I talked about the potencia, the plumed drums. The potencia outlives any given man, and upon a death, an ecobio or brother is initiated upward into an open office. Each lodge is born as the godchild of an existing lodge in a complex initiation ceremony called a barroco. So what you're seeing here, and maybe it's worth commenting upon it because Professor Sullivan has mentioned the Orisha tradition in Cuba, and perhaps some people are interested in what is the difference between the Afro-Cuban Orisha tradition in Cuba and the Abakuá. And the Abakuá has been referred to as a religion, and many of the men refer to it as a religion, but it is actually, and Abakuá speak of this themselves, they think of themselves as the African Masons. So, you know, it's a brotherhood, it's a fraternal order, it's about protection, it's about a lodge organized in a neighborhood that provides a certain kind of justice function. And in that way, it's very, very similar to its function in Old Calabar as early as the 1600s, where the lodges are houses of ekpe or ekwe, functioned as a justice society, a tribunal regulating trade. The titles in the lodges enabled men to get credit in business. That is, you could essentially trade your, I could probably use some water here. You can probably trade your title in the lodge for credit so that you could buy guns, or in this case, buy slaves. Okay, I'm only going to talk briefly about the myth of Sikán, since the curators have written about it so eloquently. Both Cristina Vives and Orlando Hernandez, they've actually written about it much better than I have. But perhaps this is another drawing from the 1920s, which was published in a criminological treatise, because at the time the Abakuá was criminalized, and so the police had essentially been attacking Abakuá lodges since about the 1870s, when it was declared illegal, or essentially a kind of conspiracy against the public order. It was regarded in Cuba in the 19th century and the early 20th century as a kind of as a scourge, and in fact a pathogen. That is, the Abakuá was a kind of infection on the Cuban body politic, and therefore what the government was most worried about is that the Abakuá would, as they say, arrastrar, or drag down the working classes into savagery and atavism. So it's interesting, you know, that's the context for this particular drawing, which comes from an Abakuá manual. But I just want you to notice, because first what I want you to notice is that the artist of this embroidered banner had access to that criminological treatise and copied almost exactly in embroidery as the banner or the bandera of this lodge, this particular rendering of the myth of Sikán. And so I want you to notice that this is the river Odan, which is probably the river Ndian in southwestern Cameroon, where a particular woman, Sikán, one day unwittingly trapped Tanze, Obon Tanze, the sacred fish that was an embodiment of the high god Abasi, in her water vessel. And there you see Sikán. So you see the river dividing the Efo or Ejagam territory from that of the Efi. Another thing is the palm tree. You see the snake. You see the goat tied to the tree. You see the crocodile. The crocodile was an avatar that was created by the Efo to protect the first Abakuá society, essentially to protect the Abakuá society against invading rival tribes. And then you see, you've read about in the catalog, the sorcerer Nasako with his sacred pot or oracle that's called Manyongo Umpabio. And so this scene essentially represents, it's like a snapshot of the moment in which Sikán raised the gourd with Tansei to her head, and a bellow of a leopard was heard throughout the region. And all of the actors, the flora and fauna, within earshot of the voice were essentially consecrated, and Sikán essentially becomes the bride of God. I remember when my professor Robert Ferris Thompson first introduced the Abakuá to us in about 1982 or 1983, and he says, this is all I want you to take away from this lecture. You've got Tansei, who embodies God, and you've got Sikán, who is Mrs. God. And that pretty much sums it up. Okay, you can go forward. Now I was going to read the myth of Sikán and Tansei, but it's been done so well in the catalog that I really think everybody should just go to the catalog. I've talked about Sikán going to the Odon River, unwittingly trapping Tansei in her water gourd, and at that moment becoming consecrated, essentially the bride of God, as the living being who was first to know the secret. She considered it hers forever. So I'm just going to read a part of the myth. After Sikán traps Tansei in her gourd, the authorities immediately attempt to silence her because it's such a powerful secret that they don't want rival peoples to get it. So condemned to silence, the terrified Sikán is sequestered in Nasako's dark cave for months, surrounded by tribal errors. Tansei, the fish, who refuses to eat, languishes in the sacred gourd and eventually dies. And actually that first banner work of Belkis, with Sikán sitting on a throne with a kind of fish crest over it, and you'll notice that there's a gourd in her lap with Tansei kind of at the bottom of the gourd. So Tansei, who refuses to eat, languishes in the sacred gourd and eventually dies. Nasako attempts to attract the voice, and when we talk about the voice, we're talking about this huge bellow. It's a bellow that sounds, and I think it would be inappropriate for me to try to reproduce the voice with my own voice. It would certainly pale in comparison. But just imagine it as a bellow. Imagine it as a leopard in a cave, a leopard roaring and just echoing and echoing and resonating and resonating. So that is the voice of Ekwe, or God. So Nasako attempts to attract the voice to Tansei's skin but fails. His sacred oracle commands him to reinvigorate Tansei's skin with Sikán's blood. To this end, the hunter-executioner Ekwenyon sacrifices Sikán, and this is not talked about very much, and I don't see it in the catalog. Ekwenyon, right here, who's the hunter and executioner in the lodge, and he's responsible for sacrificing the goat also. Ekwenyon sacrifices Sikán by strangulation with a noose, as she declares defiantly, "Ekwe is mine forever." So Nasako succeeds in building a three-legged friction drum echoing Tansei's three-part tail using the skin of the royal goat. The drum is called Ekwe, or bongo, and when played during ceremonies, it emits the roar of Ekwe. So I've included these drawings from an Abakuá manual. It's kind of a composite that I took from Lydia Cabrera's book called Ana Furuana. And what I just want you to notice, you'll see this ubiquitous figure of the fish throughout Belkis's work with the fish scales and the three-part tail, and every single fish you'll see in Belkis's work essentially looks like this. This is a drawing of Tansei being converted step by step into Ekwe, and Tansei was known as a strange fish, in some cases half eel, half toad, half strange fish from the bottom of the river, with a crest of 4 plumes. And then this is the result that Nasako creates. And so what you're getting here is a picture of the potencia of the lodge, and perhaps if there were Abakuá in the room, they might object that I'm showing secrets, but I consider that Lydia Cabrera has already desecrated the Abakuá with rather complete publication of all of its secrets, so I don't consider myself that culpable. So this is the Ekwe drum. Okay, this is another drawing. This actually comes from Fernando Ortiz, Los Instrumentos de la Música Afro-Cubana, 1952. And I'm just going to end with this because what you're getting is a picture of exactly how the Abakuá altar would look set up in the sacred temple or famba of an Abakuá lodge, which essentially would be a small building set within una tierra. So when people refer to the lodge as un juego, it's a group of men. A potencia, they're referring to the potencia of the lodge, and tierra, which refers to the grounds of the lodge. So on any given ceremony, whether it be for a funeral, whether it be for initiation, in which the elders have gathered at about 4 in the morning, have assembled the altar, have consecrated the altar, have chalked the skins of the altar with the cross. That you notice it's that cross with. So essentially everything is consecrated with this drawing, and I just want to end with, this is perhaps the most elemental Abakuá firma or signature or seal that you'll see, and you see that throughout Belkis's work. You see it on heads, you see it on drums. One of the first things that Professor Thompson taught us after the takeaway that Sikán was the bride of God is that whenever you see a circle with a cross within it, you're talking about the 4 winds. That Ekwe is essentially, it's a strong male power that comes from nature, and you have to go into the forest to look for it. And when you enter the forest, you're going to encounter the leopard. But the most elemental sign is the cross of the 4 winds, and then the eyes of Sikán over the eyes of Tanse. So in effect, the drum is really the original water gourd of Sikán, with the fish bellowing, and Sikán and Tanse present. And there's a little corner to the temple that's covered with a curtain and a sacred sign which is drawn on the ground, bringing in the force from nature to the drum. And then this is Iyamba, who is the chief, the highest chief of the lodge. He's using a palm rib, and it's a classical African friction drum. Essentially, he stands the palm rib up on the skin and uses either water or blood and rubs his fingers, and the drum sounds. So I'm going to end there with the eyes of Sikán over the eyes of Tanse. Thank you very much.
Ksenia, do you want to? I'm just going to exit.
Hi, everybody. It's an incredible honor to be part of this panel conversation and homage to Belkis Ayón. And I want to thank Blanca Serrano, Lucio Aranda, Maite Basagura from Museo del Barrio, Ed Sullivan here, and Carol and Alex Rosenberg also for their interventions, and my friend and mentor, Debbie Brown. My particular intervention will be from the place I modestly share with Belkis Ayón as an Afro-Cuban artist that, like her, look at the Afro-Cuban traditions as open-ended ciphers that connects our past with our present as sources to rescue our poorly known genealogies.
I look at those traditions as performance of healing, but Belkis' eyes that were watching God were looking, reading, and later creating an epistemology of her own, reorganizing and emphasizing the shadows and particularly the silence of the myth of Sikán. Weeks ahead of this panel, I talked to Igor Miller, someone I always envisioned here today. He, as David Brown, have created an ethnographic corpus about Afro-Cuban religions, amplifying the work of Fernando Ortiz and Lidia Cabrera. Miller is right now in Cuba conducting ethnographic research, but as Belkis is here somehow today. And fundamentally, I need to ask Igor. Igor, have you ever written anything about Belkis' work? And he says, I have used her images for classes and conferences, but when trying to write about it, I felt speechless. His answer struck me as aligning and helped me to recall my first reactions to Belkis' work in 1999 in the Visual Arts Development Center in Havana. I was speechless in front of those black and white perfect linings images. And that sensation was even heavier when I realized what the work was about. Are those reactions casual or are a calculated effect? To the tradition, Sikán's sacrifice is a given, a necessary means to restore the collective harmony. She is the magic ingredient that manifests the voice of Tanse, avatar of the supreme god Awasi. Belkis' radical subversion is to iconize the subjectivity of Sikán amidst the tragedy, witnessing the conspiracy of her loved ones on her own death. Sikán's agony was never visible until Belkis revealed it. The collographies of Ayón around Sikán was, and Igor told me this, and is in his book about Abakuá, but the translation of Sikán in some of the Kalabari languages is what is greater than God. That's what Sikán means. Reveal the torments of black womanhood in silence, prisoners on a dead road without a record, a via crucis that the world preferred not to remember. By accepting the challenge to be here today, I forced myself to break my silence, perhaps to delve, if possible, in Sikán's silence, in Belkis' sacrifice. And by doing that, some concepts gravitate toward me, like Crenshaw, intersectionality, Spivak, can the subaltern speak? But I am more inclined to the concept of an understudied Afro-Cuban intellectual, Gustavo Urrutia, plus pain, as the affective experience of people in the margins of the social ideals. And in my case, in this case, I harvest more questions than answers. What is to be a black woman? What is to be a black woman in the scopic regime of Western post-slavery society? What is to be a black woman to his own black community? What is to be a black woman in the context of Cubanness? What is to be a black woman artist from the global south, socialist country, meaning the periphery of the periphery to the contemporary art world? What is to be done? How do we manage to be alive? How do we survive? And if we survive, can we even dream to be happy? Are we entitled to our own voices? Are we entitled to our dreams? It is not ironic that we only dare to pay attention, honor, love, and admiration only when we sacrifice ourselves. And if we remove ourselves, if we complicit with our own death, social death, artistic death, is this meant to be anything else than the drum to call God, to bring salvation to others, but not to ourselves? We are living in dangers, in constant extinction, living but not entitled to our voices, to our freedom. Thank you.
talks really filled out a picture of Belkis and her world. So could we have the lights up a little bit, please? And then we have a little bit of time for interventions from the audience. So I would like everyone who participated to sit on these chairs and have us ask them questions.
Thank you.
So, do you want to come up? You can sit anywhere you want. Okay. So, actually, I hate it when there's a panel and the only conversation happens between the panelists. So I will suppress my desires to ask questions myself and to turn it over to you. So, please. And if you don't have a question to ask, I have plenty of them. So, but I would prefer that others talk. Oh, okay, I have a microphone, but... Okay, there in the back.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for all of your offerings regarding Belkis Ayón's work. A lot of the questions that I have relate to, Yesenia's kind of intervention at the end, which I think is extremely important. But I think that my line of questioning is around, beyond understanding, her contributions as just in craft, as an artist, as a printmaker, or as a visual artist, because I feel like part of us is like, we're still struggling to actually locate Belkis herself and what it is that she's contributed. And I think that this happens often in kind of intellectual discourses, like we hold up the contributions that we can kind of see, but we're not able to kind of interrogate a little further and to open up questions of identity and erasure and blackness. But I think beyond the legend of Sikán, there's a question of Ayón's legacy in terms of helping us to rethink what the Abakuá society is, which also Professor Brown's intervention helped us to understand a little bit what are the limitations of what can be said, right? Which I think is still an important ethical question, despite what Cabrera or other, earlier scholars might have, revealed. I think if we're placing Afro-Cubans at the center of our analysis and we're pushing in kind of like postmodernity in our analysis, I think there's a very important question of what, how do we discuss these things? How would Abakuá discuss these things? But Ayón, I think, by revealing, as Yesenia has helped us to think about this legend, or unsilencing the legend of Sikán, of course, Abakuá and many Afro-Cuban communities are quite aware of and have lived with the embodied knowledge for centuries. And so how does her work help us to understand Afro-Cuban understandings of what the function of Abakuá society is? Because I think also beyond religion, right, or beyond it being a fraternal order, the Abakuá society is one of the first Afro-Cuban institutions. And so how does that legacy inform how we understand the distinctions of ethnic groups, of how we have, intellectualized what the process of kind of ethnogenesis has been in Cuba itself in terms of Yoruba or Congo or Efik. And how do we also understand Ayón's death, right, from, again, an Afro-Cuban lens? Of course, we could point to Sara Gomez and many other Afro-Cubans whose lives ended early, but again, how culturally, from an Afro-Cuban perspective, how are those deaths, how are those transitions viewed? I think that they're viewed very significantly. So some of the questions that I want to put out there are, how does Abakuá get us to rethink Afro-Cuban identity and Afro-Cuban history? how does Ayón's legacy in particular of unsilencing, we can ask, to whom does she unsilence? She's not unsilencing the legend of Sikán to Afro-Cubans. But in her revealing of Sikán, how does it help us to understand the ways that Abakuá has been characterized as violent, as male, as gendered? How does it help us to rethink what women's roles have been in the community and in initiations? And how does, Ayón's death and its resonance with Sikán and her legend help us to understand death and legacy and erasure and Afro-Cuban genealogies, as Yesenia has posted?
So can I first thank you for that intervention, which I think is really a part of all of our ruminations on Belkis Ayón. Thank you so much. I think it probably just in my role as a moderator, if you don't mind, I'm just going to boil down the question a little bit because there were many, many different perceptions there and many questions. And I wondered if, both David and Yesenia could talk about, I think, the kernel of what you were asking is, how does Belkis Ayón illuminate for us? How does her work illuminate some of the questions about Abakuá's role in Cuban society and role in the articulation of the place of women of color? And could I also add one question to that? And maybe David could also answer it as part of the comments to your very, very, I think, elegant statement here, is how would Belkis Ayón have known about the secret societies? So Yesenia and David, or Blanca, or Carol and Alex, please feel free to comment on any of those things. Would you like to say it?
I wish him to start because he's the
Well,
religion. So
I'm blown away by our new intervention, and I'd like to talk with you afterwards and get your card. And perhaps you should have been on the panel. I think that Cristina Vive's text makes really clear that Belkis used every available source. The sources in particular, in chronological order, would have been Lydia Cabrera, who published first on the Abakuá in the mid-1950s, before she left Cuba, and then wrote a couple of books after. But I went through several of the images where very specific Abakuá iconography shows up, and I was able to trace her use of a number of the signs, particularly in the piece called Niloro, the funeral piece, to Enrique Sosa Rodriguez's book from 1982 called Los Ñáñigos. And it had won the Premio Casa de las Americas when it was published, and it was probably the most visible book. It was in every single stall in the Plaza de Armas and in the Librería Fernando Ortiz on Calle L. And so I traced those signs to the appendix of that book, and they're part of the funerary corpus of Ana Mangui, who is the Idame, or mass dance figure that appears in that. Other than that, I'm sure she plumbed Cabrera, and Cristina also mentioned something very interesting, which is a word that perhaps elite society doesn't attribute to the Abakuá, but she used the phrase intellectuals within the Abakuá, and I think you've very eloquently pointed to the Abakuá as an alternative society within a society. It's a point of certainty, or it's a point of order, it's a point of judgment, within a neighborhood, and not directly opposed to, it's not like they're walking around with placards, Bajo Fidel, but it is an alternative society within a society, and I think that has to be looked at. What is your identity as a Cuban and an Afro-Cuban if you belong to the Abakuá society? And, certainly, analogously, what would Belkis have been thinking, as a kind of intellectual of the Abakuá? And maybe I'll defer to Yesenia, who kind of blew me away with with her talk.
Well, it's a great pleasure to me to also be a friend of Jalil that sent us this question. So I know you and I know why we've been connected for so many years, because we are artists, we are intellectuals, but we are also an activist. So we embody several positions in different levels of responsibility to our communities. But I don't know, so I think like some of your questions are motivated because you are also an activist, you know, and you are aware of the stigmas around Abakuá and many other Afro-Cuban religions, and this is something that is happening here, is happening in Cuba, it has happened historically, and we know very well that history, right? But I don't think, I did not have the chance to meet personally Belkis Ayón, but I don't think of her work as an activist type of work. She was an artist. She was an artist, and her art is amazing, and she don't need to be an artist. Everybody cannot be everything, right? Why we should ask? No, she's an artist. Her sensitivity, her place, her channeling of the spirit, whatever, you know, was great enough to produce this amazing art, right? So I think like in that art, because I don't know if we know of this concept of aura from Benjamin, no, that this is like the art has an aura, but I think like Belkis work has an aura. Like everybody is like, oh my God, what is this? No? So, but it's pretty much because she portrayed Black womanhood as a subject in crisis, as a subjectivity in crisis. Do you have any doubt about it? I know you don't. I know you don't. I know you don't. Me neither. Okay, so. And this is a crisis that is experienced inside our own communities and outside the other communities. So I think like this was Belkis' intervention. This is not our intervention. You know, this is not your intervention. There are many other things that can be done in terms of the stigma, whatever. But this was her, and it was great because revealed Sikán's subjectivity into a level that nobody could envision before. No? And some, I don't know, when I went back today to the exhibit, and then we were together for a few hours before coming here, I realized that already, like Cristina Vives and other people, and probably like Belkis, she talked about the Via Crucis, no? The Via Crucis. But honestly, when we think about the suffering of Jesus Christ, this is something that is so visible. You don't need to be Christian to be aware of the surface of Jesus Christ. It's all over the place. It's in the Bible. It's this. So I think this is the work that Belkis Ayón does for us, you know, to reveal the different stages of that suffering. You know? So I don't know if this is like this is the best answer I can give you right now. I don't know. I know this is not answering everything what you're asking, but I think we should. This is the work. This is what is there, and it's art, and it's amazing, and serve a purpose. And one of the things that I always remember this panel for was because the Alex intervention about Belkis, because I am not, I'm a different type of artist. I am a performance artist. I am not the type of artist, so I have no idea about the technique. You know, I can read the catalog or whatever says, but Well, she was an innovator. She created something that nobody had ever done before, and so far nobody had been able to repeat, right? So, Sikán, I don't know, it's just there, no?
You know, if you get hold of her catalog resume, which exists, you find that she entered art school at the age of 12. She never did another subject except the one on Abakuá. Her entire life was devoted to a simple method that she had devised of making prints, both in subject and in manner of creating them. I don't know of another artist who ever emulated her, because this was her life's ambition, her life's drive. Her earliest work is on the Abakuá, and her latest work is at the Abakuá. And in between, there never was anything else. That's all she did. I know of no other artist who only worked in one subject all their life and in one manner. And I want you to know something, that in order for her to achieve some of these prints, which are in 4 or 6 portions, the prints were made principally colored by hand. They had to match. All the sections had to match. So even though the edition may end up as being 4, she may have made 100 prints before she could get 4 that where all the sections matched. This was the most difficult type of work that a person could undertake, both subject-wise and in the methodology of her work.
Good. Are there other comments in the back? And then over here at the side. First back there.
I'm just going to build off your question a little bit. So I think this is my first time being exposed to her work, and it's phenomenal. So we're talking about activism, we talk about intellectualizing her work, and I want to take the question to a more esoteric framework and then think about channeling. When you get channeled with spirit, I've seen it. We've seen it in different religious texts, and mostly it's in writing, right? But there's also been phenomena where people get spirit and they draw. So when I'm looking at that, there are images that are way too familiar in my DNA that I cannot articulate. But at the same time, like, she's speaking on another level that I don't think any of us right now can intellectualize. So the question back to the panel, have there been investigations about maybe spiritual channeling through her work? And her technique is, the reason why it probably can't be duplicated is that inspiration that she was working with, you can't duplicate, you can't commodify that. So this is just something I'm throwing back.
Do you want to talk about that at all? Actually, it's a brilliant question without an answer, because you've answered your own question. So I mean, it's a perfect whole in itself. So I mean, that's also a wonderful contribution to this panel, because this type of spiritual commentary on what we are looking at as fine art in a more conventional sense is the other side, and in a sense the much deeper and richer side. That if Belkis Ayón is able to touch each individual in the way that she has touched you without your ever having seen her before, that is, I think, not to sound too emotional about it, but I think it is like the most extraordinary sense of communication between an artist and an individual member of the public who is literally ingesting or communicating with the artist and with the work. So that seems to me, as I said, a sort of perfect embodiment of the approach that probably you have expressed the things that I've been thinking about for 25 years.
Well, I have here in France row my brother we call each other husband and wife, but it's just a joke. Wilfredo Bucos Matos, that he's also a performing artist and he's a medium. And we have, like, from the very beginning of our friendship, a conversation about this and about what we do and how we create, no? So I think I have known many different type of artists. There are artists that are very cool and very smart, very articulate about what they do, and they are not interesting at all in terms of what they produce. And that doesn't mean that they won't go to a gallery or get, you know, the higher grants that exist in the land, whatever. But I don't know, through this conversation and through my own practice and through the practice of other artists, I know, especially people of color, especially people that interact in a regular basis with our African traditions, with our legacies, with that material, you know, that is not necessarily the Western material. We have no doubt. We are channeling. I know she's channeling. This is something that is not a question for me. Of course she is. No? And sometimes the result of channeling not necessarily has to be perfect. Channeling is like he should say, you know, like, okay, that nobody have ever done occurs to me that possibly I can do it. And she did it, and it worked. And it's unique, and nobody can repeat it. She's channeling, yes, she is. And I don't know who was talking to her, but she was channeling. And that's what creates this connection to her own material, because she knew Sikán erased character, you know, from this mythology. Why? Because she was unique, because she was the only one able to attract the Spirit of God, the only one that was able to catch it, because African and folk were trying to find Tanse for years, and they couldn't. And Tanse came only to her. She was channeling? Yes, she was. You know, so channeling is not for us something that, you know, you don't have to be necessarily in a trance, you know, to be a channel. You know, you can be a channel. Like, I went to the museum today to channel Belkis, to get in with her, in alignment with her spirit, to talk to you today. Well, occurs to me, there is no other way I can do anything. You know, all what I do is channeling. So, I don't know. Good, bad answer.
I don't, in my experience with her discussing the work, and I knew her really very, very well, I never asked her how she came to get so involved in the Abakuá myth. But it never came out. I don't know how old she was when she first learned about it, but everything in her discussion of her work was always about the myth. It was never about seeing herself. We know she saw herself as Sikán because of the way she depicted Sikán in all of the work. But I'm sure that so many of the things that I heard today from you, were all there. But she never had a discussion where she said, I'm in that work, or that work is me as a black woman. And she never ever discussed it. Her work was she lived that myth. Every piece of work that she ever discussed with me, it was all about Sikán, who she was, what she was doing, why she was doing it. It was never about Belkis, how her inner feelings were. that were coming out in those works.
Were they
So it was like
self-portraits?
melded.
Were they self-portraits?
Yes, they were self-portraits, but she never discussed it on a human level. You know, like you might in the back want to talk about, or you might want to talk about. I mean, people often see themselves in paintings and they depict their feelings or an experience that they lived through, and they can they might even discuss it with you if they're close enough to you. But she always was discussing the myth as though it was there and she was here. But that wasn't the case.
I think it was a perfect blending, because Belkis could not exist without this, not obsession, because that sounds very negative, without this engagement, complete and utter channeling, if you want to use that word, or engagement as part of her universe. That was the center core, it seemed to me.
Yes, that was her universe.
There was another question somewhere over there. Yes.
I actually have a very simple question. Understanding that the family is keeping her work, and earlier listening to Alex talking about the low quality materials used, what are the resources and what is the longevity of the work? How are they?
That's something Alex should answer as the master printmaker, or master printer.
I would say that it's miraculous that the work has held up this long. I mean, I would have predicted it would have died by now because the material is so inferior. But it seems to hold up.
You've seen, we have La Cena in our dining room.
I know.
And you can, anyone can come and see it. It's in pretty great condition. And of course, we don't touch it. We protected it we did protect it by having it backed with linen, so that all of the pieces don't have to be tacked up or taped with some tape that they do on foam core when you see them in exhibitions. And I did that with all of the multiple pieces that I have that are made of multiple prints. I even did it with some of the works that were individual prints because of the fact that protects it. I mean, a restorer who would restore some of the leading, older works of the other centuries and knew how to do that. I mean, it's all archivally done. But, so they I don't know, I've never seen any that were in bad condition.
Backing it with linen is a preservative.
Yeah. The other thing I find very interesting, and maybe some of you do too, is that artists usually go through periods in their life, even though she died at a young age. I mean, you find an artist, if you look at their work, they started out with figurative work and then they get into abstract, because they move into different, but not her. She always stayed within that same story, and there is a story behind every one of her works. Now, I mean, I suppose that people who've delved more into I'm fascinated by listening to Dr. Brown because I didn't know, some of those things. That picture of that lodge in Regla, I mean, I'd like to go there and see. I've been in Regla so many times, I didn't even know it existed. But, I mean, it's fascinating that it's a whole life, and she lived that life.
So I think we have time for one more question because there's one right here. Maybe we'll have two last questions.
Well, it's pretty simple. So I was just wondering, sort of in connection with what you just said, did she have actual contact with these Abakuá societies, or was she just studying them? And I mean, you mentioned a couple of times how charismatic she was, and I just wondered if she charmed her way into one of these lodges, or that's just a fantasy.
Actually, that's part of what I wanted to ask you too. Could a woman do that?
Well, I don't know of other women who have done it except for Lydia Cabrera. In a sense, Lydia Cabrera is a very, very complex figure. She grew up, she was a kind of rebel. She was a gay woman living in a gay relationship in a restored Baroque mansion next to the poor neighborhood of Pogoroti. Lydia Cabrera had informants, if you want to call them that. Maybe they were her friends also. Informants within a whole variety of lodges. And if you look in her book, La Sociedad Secreta Abakuá, the Abakuá Secret Society, you know, for lack of a better term, Lydia Cabrera is channeling through her text, which is not all her voice. It's a kind of assemblage of voices based upon her ethnography of participant observation and through, we might call it direct quoted discourse. So her book, in a sense, channels the voices of dozens of Abakuá. Lydia Cabrera did it before, you know, Belkis, and I only know from the curatorial text that she formed very, very close relationships with what she referred to as the intellectuals within the Abakuá. Now, I showed you a picture of Juan Mokongo, who comes from, you know, a very erudite tradition within the Abakuá, you know, preserving, you know, old manuscripts that are perhaps 100 years old, copying over them by hand, memorizing them, and then teaching them to new initiates. So, you know, Juan was an intellectual within the Abakuá, and so, you know, I can see her, you know, very harmoniously forming relationships with Abakuá members, but, you know, not everybody is going to be agreeable. I took those pictures in the Abakuá Lodge in Regla. The picture that I showed you of the altar was set up in Juan's home, and just a few weeks later, he had me at 4 o'clock in the morning, you know, waiting for him to break out of the lodge with the procession, that picture of which you saw, and he was like, David, take as many pictures as you want, you know, and I had my, you know, my Nikon cameras, you know, 3 camera bodies and 3 flashes and all kinds of reflectors, and I started popping away at the live, you know, proceedings of the Abakuá ceremony, and I was physically attacked by younger members of the lodge who, you know, physically threw me out, you know, with my camera equipment onto the street, and I had to get into my car and, you know, race away. Now, that's just an example of, you know, a white male American tourist, turista, you know, taking pictures, but, you know, there are intellectuals within the lodge, and then there are, you know, more conservative, let's say, forces within the lodge, but I can see her very harmoniously working with Abakuá.
So there's one last question, if you could pass the microphone.
I just want to add like something very briefly, and it is like following on the steps of David's answer, and I mentioned the word epistemology in my presentation, and I think part of the stigmas that exist around these practices is like we don't see them as epistemologies, and we don't see them as practices that are being kept for organic intellectuals. And this is a very important perspective here, also to understand that those practices have their own theology. Now, it requires of intellectuals that interpret and pass it into the next generation, etc. So, and yeah, there are certain tensions, like in the example that you just mentioned, but I don't know. There is many people that are Abakuás and have different perspective about their own practices and about their own of what is a secret. You know, this is just an answer. It's a question that has as many answers as Abakuá people. Probably there is, you know. So it's not strange to have like really open and incredibly interesting conversations with people that do the practice and then practice in the right way and understand our practices as conceptual practices. Now that's the key.
Okay, one last comment?
Yeah, my question might be answered already. I just want to say thank you, everybody. This was really interesting. But I guess my question was, since she was working with these themes since she was young, I wanted to ask, did she have like family that was Abakuá, or maybe just because she was Cuban, she knew of these things. And then I guess the second part would be, what was the relationship of Abakuá to her? Like, was it antagonistic? Did some of them maybe appreciate that she did this work, or did they hate her? Did they, you know, I'm new to this, so just that kind of question.
Well, as someone who did know her, she, as Carol said before, she didn't really address these issues directly. This was part of her life, sort of a seamless thing. It was something that she was within, and it was within her, and it was not a necessarily topic of conversation. I don't know if anyone knows, and maybe Carol, because you knew her even better than I did, whether she actually spoke about her personal interventions or her engagements with members of the Abakuá. I think she never did to me, and I don't think that she did to anyone that I know.
Well, it's interesting because that's when I never thought to ask her. I never thought, you know, it was almost like I didn't, and I'm sitting here now thinking, why didn't you ask her if she ever went to, you know, an Abakuá meeting? I never did. Maybe I didn't do it because I thought it would be a little bit, intrusion. Her sister certainly is not a practitioner. But I'm going to ask Katia if she knows if Belkis ever went, or Sandra Ramos. I mean, you know, these people. Sandra was so close to Belkis, and it was like almost you would have thought that she would have known. And I'm going to ask her too. I'm going to call her up tonight or tomorrow because that's stimulating. Why I never thought to ask her, I don't know, but it was such a strange secret society that I was so fascinated by what I was hearing and having a hard enough time understanding it that I just never thought, you know, and nobody here seems to have any clue as to whether or not she actually went.
So I have always thought that good panels end with a question. And so this seems to me to be the perfect question on which we can then reunite at another point and hear the answer from